now since I've covered the introduction, I try and use this as an opportunity to talk about, also one other thing is I'll be switching between the slides and some demos as well. And I'm almost making an assumption that some of those folks might be in the audience might not be very, very familiar with some capabilities of generative AI. So we'll talk about some things that are happening in Palm and Gemini as well. And I'm sure you're interested in knowing more about it as well, right? So, so I started off with my introduction. I've given the background for it, but we'll start off with a bit of a primer for artificial intelligence as well. I think I can see the screens here. Probably have to turn back and look. So a bit of a history lesson here. We've had three major shifts in technology so far. First one was internet, of course. I started talking about it a little bit, and Google built these products and capabilities that helped make people connect with each other, share information. And then when mobile was the next technological shift, we created platforms that allowed people to have the just-in-time, just-in-the-moment experiences as well. And AI is no different as well, right? And we'll talk about some of the things that we're doing and stuff that you can make available in your product technology stack as well. The machine learning space, this area has gone into deep specialization. So from standard machine learning to deep learning itself, there's been quite a bit of a stretch. But at the core of generative AI, there is a special type of machine learning model you heard from the previous talk as well around large language models. And that is really what the secret sauce for some of these capabilities are, right? A very short video, about 2 minutes, just to set the context and background. It's a nice fancy video as well. So hopefully it'll wake everyone up as well as the coffee kicks in. And we'll set the context of what generative AI is capable of.
Generative AI is everywhere, and it's a game changer with the potential to transform the world as we know it. Think of the leap to the mobile phone, or from snail mail to the internet. That's how big of a deal it is. But what exactly is it? Generative AI is called generative because it generates new things. Basically, generative AI learns from tons of data. Text, images, audio, and data. Lots of data to craft something new based on your input. The models that power generative AI tools are data consumers absorbing billions of words, images, and audio clips, spotting patterns and making connections. So when you toss it a prompt, like a sentence or a question, the model conjures up a response using the information it's gathered, no matter how niche. It's not searching the web. Instead, it's using everything it's learned to craft something specifically for you. So the more specific your prompt is, the better the results. In the past, these large language models could only predict single words. But today, Google AI can tackle entire sentences, paragraphs, or even massive documents. It can help you write emails, break language barriers, create poetry, write ad copy, write a birthday song, the marketing, create product backlash your coworkers, and so much more. So whether you're trying to reach the masses or just that one special person, Google AI is here to help.
Cool. All right. So with that background, sort of helps you understand the concept behind generative AI. But what we've also realized is it's not just natural language processing, but the ability to have natural language understanding has led to really some cool technologies that we're seeing. In fact, the previous talk, we talked about the emergent technologies as well. What we realize is if you throw enough data and training, we have these models develop capabilities that we've not seen before. In fact, this is Palm 2, just 540 billion parameters. The newer ones are actually much bigger in size. But they tend to grow these new capabilities, these emergent capabilities. In fact, when we look at the benchmark here against how these are growing, the baseline over there is really what the human capabilities are. And some of these emergent capabilities have actually now either are at par at human skills or exceeding them. And that delta up there is really where the opportunity lies, right? And that's what we're going to spend some time talking about today, right? So with all of that background set, you must be wondering, how does this help my business? How do I apply this in the context of the business? And this is where the concepts and framework I spoke about earlier comes into play, right? So we'll cover that very briefly. The first one is around how do you think about the stack, right? Now, by stack here, I'm not necessarily talking about the open source frameworks and technologies. I'm talking about individual capabilities itself. And this is part of the problem because these have emerged over a period of time and people have seen them in parts, but they've not really seen what it means when you compose them together, right? And our idea is that you should really look at it like a layered stack of cake itself, right? So if you were to look at the various capabilities, with of course cherry at the top, and I'll talk about what that looks like. So if you look at the framework here, right at the bottom is foundation models, things that you typically get from open source projects, you get from service providers like us, and that's really where the crux of the capabilities lie. On top of that are these individual capabilities that you saw, which is the search and classify, summarize, those sort of capabilities. But you compose them to create use cases. And then you apply the use case in a specific industry. So let's see what that actually looks like, right? If you were to look at what the stack looks like at the bottom here, you end up, with various infrastructure capabilities to build a large language model. You can choose to build this yourself, but it requires millions of dollars of investment. But you could actually get a head start by leveraging relationships with open source projects or with cloud providers. And then you've got these individual capabilities here, which are around generalization, summarization, etc. And when you compose them, you create these use cases. But right at the top is a classic example of bots, right? And they are specific to the industry. So whether it is a finance assistant bot or a compliance assistant bot, then they are more relevant in the industry. So when you think about use cases in your organization, don't think in terms of generate and summarize, but think about how do you compose those use cases, capabilities together to create for a specific use case. But the cherry on the top is essentially the right side, which is the personas that you want to target. Because in order to get a stakeholder to sell a use case in an organization, you need to know who you're addressing as well. So if you look at this from the mapping point of view, it gives you a reference point to look at, right? So that's the first concept that I want to talk about, to think about not just capabilities in isolation, which is what most people tend to look at, but look at the overall stack and how do you do the composition. The second concept is around how the value is generated within generative AI itself. So right at the bottom is foundation models, right? And that is, pretty much commodity in due course of time. Everyone will have access to it. Today, people who make a head start are a bit ahead, but eventually most people will have access to it. All you need is a credit card, sign up, and you have access to these large language models. But the bit that really differentiates you, where your competitive moat lies, is in your business workflows, right? In your data in your organization. So now more than ever, the value of having a strong data strategy is very, very relevant. And I'll talk about an example of a company that actually took this approach, looked at their business workflow and the data, and transformed the business. And it'll give you an idea of how to take the capabilities we saw in the previous concept and apply it in a workflow and transform and create new market differentiating experiences, right? So with that background, your question must be, how do I apply this to my business and enterprise? And let's just talk about this with some specific, I think there's some capabilities here we should talk about. But roughly the approaches that I wanted to cover were these three, right? So, and there are different ways of looking at it, but I would sort of, for the sake of brevity here, I talk about the automate, augment, and innovate side of things. And we'll talk about one example in each one of them, right? So let's look at automate in the first place. So one of the big opportunities that generative AI provides is the ability to deal with unstructured data, right? In the past, if you've ever written regular expressions, you would fully appreciate how much of a pain it is to manage and maintain that. Even attempts to use traditional models and be able to work with that has always been a challenge. But generative AI solves that quite extensively. I think there are some demos here that I wanted to show what models like Gemini are capable of, which are truly multimodal, which essentially means your input of unstructured data could be a combination of text and code and video and images. So you could do all of that and provide extensions together, right? So, so the first one is a video here, right? And in this case, it's a standard video, nothing fancy here, just a bit of a seashore here. And there's a prompt which basically asks it to generate a tourism ad for the video. So the ability for Gemini to be able to look at frame by frame within the video and understand what's in it and be able to compose a paragraph of text is, shows an ability to deal with videos and text together, right? Here's another example. In this case, there's an image with a non-standard font. So it's not an OCR problem. It is an image and it has to understand what's written inside it. And the prompt here is to read the text, what is within the image, right? So it generates the output here. Here's another example, slightly more tricky. So in this case, you see a number of images, and it does have a JSON object next to it, which basically explains what is in the image, but it also shows the contextual part, talks about the city and the landmark as well. So what it does in this case is it has a third image, but it does not have the next set of output, doesn't say what is it about and which city is it in. So with that, it is able to generate that. Now imagine trying to do this through traditional programming or even through traditional machine learning, and that can be quite a tricky affair. Okay. And one last example, just to make a point about being able to deal with unstructured data. Here's a good example of fishmonger with some prices and prices showing up. But here the prompt is to be able to extract the items and prices. So the concept of what looks like a price card and the idea of being able to extract numbers, but more importantly also return back in a structured format as well. So it renders the JSON object as well, right? So I wanted to show these quick examples just to bring home the point that the ability to deal with unstructured data is now a solved problem for the most part, and that unlocks a lot of capabilities, right? So let's see how you apply this within a use case. So this is an example of a workflow for a company. In this case, this company was into selling second-hand cars, and the typical workflow was if somebody had a car they wanted to sell, they would actually send an email with some pictures or request for an appointment. Then somebody would go around looking at that email and schedule an appointment. And in due course of time, you would drive your car up there and look at, do a manual inspection of the car. And at that point of time, you get an email back saying this is the possible value for the car. And as a customer, you might choose to sell your car at that price or be disappointed and say, well, too bad, I lost time and I lost money, right? Now that's really a flow here, and the problem with this is that the velocity at which this workflow moves is also has a direct impact on the rate at which new cars can show up. So on the buyer side, when you go to the second-hand car side, you need to be able to see a rich selection of cars. So if you are an inventory manager or somebody whose job is to onboard new second-hand cars to sell, this is a constraint you've got to deal with, right? So if you look at the problems that it comes up with, the first one is the offer acceptance rate being low because you don't know what you're going to get until you go through the appraisal process. So there's an invested time that you have to go through. The second one is there is manual effort involved. So somebody has to be employed to walk around the car, look at the car structure itself. And obviously the experience itself is pretty poor, right? Now let's look at where the opportunity lies from generative AI point of view. So this space here, and there could be other areas, but if you just look at the part in the middle, is where you have the opportunity to take out elapsed time and effort, right? So those are your opportunities, and typically these things in traditional world would have been a hard problem to solve. But let's look at how we've solved it for one of our customers. So in this case, somebody sends an email on Gmail, of course. Why not? Why wouldn't you use any other provider? And you send the images as well. Now this is a human readable text which basically says, I have driven the car these many kilometers, this is the model, make, and some general example. And we use Gemini's reasoning and language understanding capabilities to parse the information out of it and extract specs, so the stuff that you see on the right side, right? So what this allows the appraisal manager to do is to get a good understanding of the product that the potential customer is trying to sell, because they might not necessarily not know about all the makes and models that are available. But here's one step forward, right? We look at the images and extract the damage detection within these objects and identify where there are problems. And you can put in some business rules to actually figure out what is the extent of damage, and hence to that effect, what should be the pricing for it. Obviously, you need to put in business rules as well to say if the model is this and the year is this, how to calculate the pricing, right? And with all of that information, you can actually generate a response. So this is the create part of generative AI, where you can create a human readable response which says, here's the potential price, and this is what you're likely to get, and here are the reasons why you're likely to get that amount. Now, we are very strong proponents of human in the loop, so we will never recommend sending an email automatically just in case it hallucinates and you have a big problem. So the idea here is that it falls in line to the process of the workflow and generates the draft for you to then select, review, and accept, and send it if you feel that is appropriate. So if you were to look at the previous problems that we looked, this is how sort of what we're solving. But more important part is the user experience gets a lot better, because now you're not waiting for scheduling, you're not waiting for manual effort, you're not waiting for an unknown amount that you're likely to get. Through this process, you actually get to a point where you have about 80 to 90% certainty of what is the likely amount you're going to get for the car. So when you do show up to sell, you more or less know what to expect, and that helps improve the the experience itself. And that obviously helped accelerate the onboarding of second-hand cars on the platform for other sellers to sell. We have a customer in North America that applied this at scale, and it was transformative for them. This is one of the very few first generative AI actual practical implementations we've seen in the business. So obviously, all of these things don't come without risk, right? I wanted to highlight 3 of them just to keep in mind, for you to keep in mind. The first one is around hallucinations. We've heard about this several times, but this is now getting to be a more or less enough of the capabilities are in place to solve this. Most of it is done through grounding. So as you come up with content, make sure it points to a source of reference. There is some degree of citation, so you know where the content was generated from and on what basis. The second one is around the source data itself. And this is quite important because a lot of times people take models from open source and they're not fully aware of what is the data set that was used to train and who did the classification for this if it was required, and the data set is balanced enough or not, right? And that is important because it creeps in. If you're doing a loan approval process, you don't want to bias it for one kind of data set versus the other. And the third one is around legality as well. Now, who generates the content and who consumes the content and who's the owner, where is the copyright? All of these things are complicated problems because it all goes back to the data that was used to train the model in the first place. So the good news is at Google Cloud, we solve for pretty much all 3 of these areas. And obviously, talk to us about it if you have problems around it. But we've actually changed our terms and conditions to give you cover in case you do get challenged for content that is generated through the generative AI capability itself, right? So the second part is augmentation. So this is the second approach on the same line. And in fact, just to set the context here, we actually looked at some of the statistics that we collected from a leaders circle meeting that happened last year at Google Next. And of the top concerns that leaders had, the 2 areas that they wanted the most focus was around automation efficiency. So we spoke about automation. We saw an example of what that looks like. But then they realized a lot of their head office people cost, especially for IT firms, was in IT spend itself. So software development efficiency became quite an important aspect of it, right? And to get a sense of who's in the room, how many engineers, software engineers, people who write code on a daily basis are in the room, right? Quite a few. Good. Right conference to be at, more importantly, right? Okay, so let's look at some of the challenges that developers seem to see. HDMI not being one of them. So the first one is around being able to switch context. So as you move between your code editor to Stack Overflow, and then taking the code, readjusting that, all of that stuff is a big context resetting challenge, right? The second one is, especially if you're doing container-based development, the writing code, writing tests, testing it locally, deploying it remotely, and then testing it. Everyone understands how much of a broken process that looks like as well. And the third one is around things that you need to do, but they don't necessarily translate into business impact. So yes, you've got to write great documentation because the next developer will find out where you live and go after you. Or you have to write unit test cases to make sure that next time you add a feature, what else have you broken in the process. But it doesn't really translate into exciting business outcome as well. And last one is my favorite. Anyone who's ever worked in an organization long enough has to deal with legacy code. It's one of those things you wish the ghost of the previous developer was there to help you understand why this code was written and why does it work like that. I hope you can relate to some of these images. This is an interesting study from McKinsey, and I thought this was quite relevant for this conversation because AI is actually helping developers with efficiency, but it is also important to understand what aspects of development process is where AI is most effective, right? So if you see of the 4 or 5 areas that we spoke about, the code documentation part is ability to understand what's in a function or in a class and add documentation to it is one of those mundane tasks that developers today suffer with, but you can actually leverage. In fact, that is the highest area of impact from an AI point of view, right? Refactoring, optimization, code generation, all of that stuff is all right. But the part on the right is quite an interesting data point because that's where AI typically tends to have the lowest amount of impact. Now, if you have to write a complex algorithm, if you have to come up with a new sorting algorithm, don't expect AI to come up with one just yet, hopefully. And so, the worry that we have about AI taking away software developers' jobs is sort of a bit of a farce. The good news here is you're moving up the value chain and actually writing stuff, good stuff, complicated stuff that really, will, validate the reason why you actually took the job in the first place. So we'll just look at a quick demo of what this looks like in a day-to-day interaction. I'm not going to be writing code with an AI editor because I think everyone's seen what that looks like. Let's look at what that looks like in this case. So here's an example, and I show this as a way to encourage areas where you could use. So this is using a large language model called Cody within Google Cloud, and this is domain trained on code. A lot of it is Google code, which is obviously license free in that sense, but a lot of other free license code in that sense. So the prompt here is to generate a code for data classification for a NIST data set. I think everyone would see this as the hello world of machine learning, nothing fancy here. So it generates a bunch of code for you to work. Now, once you've written the code, everyone realizes that there is a need for optimization for an epoch count. Anyone who does this the first time would see this as a regular challenge. So here, instead of saying keep training for the number of cycles I've asked you to train, optimize this code for me and try a few different approaches, right? Because I'm learning, I don't know what the different approaches are. So give me a couple of approaches for it. Oops. So in this case, it comes back with a callback function, which is probably the most commonly used approach, early stopping, and some other ideas. So it comes up with a few ideas, shows a bit of code snippet for you to apply, and then you can actually give it instructions to say, can you re-implement this using one of the specific approaches, right? So in this case, it goes off and rewrites the code, and then you have a new version. Now, in this case, you actually also have some parameters that you're trying to get your head around, and particularly around optimizers, right? So as a new developer, you can actually say, what are my various options for optimizers? Because the example that it generates is using Adam, and it comes up with a couple of examples of various optimizers and explains that. Now, if you remember the first bullet point about switching context, this is the point I'm trying to bring home, amongst other things, right? In a typical development scenario, you would have gone back to documentation. You need to know what to search for, and then you need to understand what is written. You can actually, in this case, ask a follow-up question against it. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm asking, these are great, right? But can you help me understand the pros and cons? I think the gradient descent one looks interesting, but I want to compare it with Adam and understand in my specific use case, which optimizer would seem to make more sense, right? So it gives the explanation for that. In fact, it goes on one limb, actually doing a pros and cons table, helps you understand that, and validates the decision it made about choosing the optimizer it chose in the first place itself, right? Now, so this is a good enough interaction, and think about this as a team which has junior developers and senior developers, right? This would have been an interaction between a junior and a senior developer, but a very patient one. Obviously, it takes time to document it and make things available. But then we also have one of these great team leads as well, who can come back and say, can you convert this to JavaScript, right? So yeah, you can do that as well, right? So this is the developer augmentation part that I want to talk about, more around the augmenting capabilities as well. So that's two of the three approaches. The third one is around innovation. Now, this part I thought it was worthy adding because the way product development happens is also on the verge of changing, right? And I wanted to make a point through one of the examples that we're using at Google and as a good framework for you to think about. Now, if you look at how products are developed today, the product managers tend to have a predefined, a preconceived notion of the customer journey, and it also has a good sense of the data sets that are involved to make that journey. So it knows what the first-party data sources are, what the third-party data sources are. In fact, they've already stitched the user journey even before the user showed up on the website, and that's really what the path is going to be, right? Now, imagine a world where you actually could just type this in a text box and it can construct a user journey on the fly for you, right? So let's say you want to do a trip and you want to plan to go somewhere, and you typically use a travel site. Now, in the traditional sense, the travel site would have access to flights, hotels, taxis, pretty much, maybe something else. But in reality, you do actually a lot more than that, right? You need to find out, do you need clothes? Do you need visa? Do you need forex, currency? Loads of things, right? Now, there's an interesting concept here around React in prompt engineering and large language models, where you can actually prompt a large language model to reason its way through and explain what needs to be done and why should it be done, and what input is required and what output would come out of that step itself, right? And this is a good framework, and it's emerging. We've heard RAG enough number of times. This is yet another platform approach to look at it. And actually, let me show you an example of what this looks like when we ask Gemini. right? So the big leg up that Gemini has over Palm in the past is its ability to reason, right, and ability to think clearly. So if you have a look at the prompt here, the prompt basically says that you're a seasoned travel expert, and I would want to go on a business travel, but I also would want you to help me plan, schedule, and execute my travel, right? So I've explicitly stated that. And then I've asked it to give me an output in a structured format, and I've asked for the outputs, the clarification, who should I talk to, the list of provider, and give me the full list and make it as detailed as possible. And with that, it actually comes back to the various steps that are required, right? And it helps me understand that, if I need to plan on a trip, the first reason is I need to know what the purpose is, right? And there are very interesting insights that it comes through this. So think about how you would go about as a human being thinking about some of the user journeys, and actually it builds a pretty detailed list. For example, it'll talk about the inputs required for it and what is the output. So if you apply for a visa, obviously the output is going to be visa, right? And you can build all of that stuff around it. So when you ask for a query like this, you end up with a list of providers based on the reasoning of the steps required for it, and then you stitch the user journey together. So how would that look like in real life, right? As a product manager, you create a privacy-safe manner, create an API interface in a privacy-safe manner that encourages providers to actually onboard on your platform and connect to your systems. And then essentially when the user journey is created on the fly, it looks at the list of providers it has in its ecosystem and exchanges data with them to understand what is required. So you saw the input and output in the Japan example I showed earlier. It can then interact with the providers to do that. The LLM then actually looks at what the query was and creates a user journey on the fly. And then you use an orchestrator to stitch that user journey and create a new user interface. So I wanted to talk about this so that you sort of get an context of how some of these new user journeys can look significantly different. In fact, we use this in one of the commonly used tools within Bard, right? So I wanted to show this 3 minutes video just to quickly show you how we're using this within the Google ecosystem itself. And you could do this within your product as well.
It's hard to make an idea come to life when the information you need is in different places. But now you can collaborate with the world's information and your own, all in one place with Bard. With extensions, Bard can now connect to Google's apps and even gives you the option to pull in your own information to make it all come together. Like when you're making a plan. Or when you're prepping for the big day. Or when you want to make sense of something. Bard can even help you make memories. Pull in the info you need just when you need it, so you can keep your ideas moving forward with Bard as your helpful collaborator. Try for yourself at bard.google.com.
Cool. All right. So sort of helps you set the context of how we're doing it in Bard, and you could apply this in your product as well, right? And none of these presentations would be complete without a nice fancy demo of Gemini, right? But I wanted to extend the idea of being able to create user journey on the fly with using Gemini. The next video actually talks about the demo of what that looks like.
It's a demo of Gemini's multimodal reasoning capabilities to understand and reason about users' intent, use tools, and generate bespoke user experiences that go beyond chat interfaces. Let's say I'm looking for inspirations for a birthday party theme for my daughter. Gemini says, I can help you with that. Could you tell me what she's interested in? So I say, sure, she loves animals, and we're thinking about doing something outdoors. At this point, instead of responding in text, Gemini goes and creates a bespoke interface to help me explore ideas. It's good. lots of ideas, it's visually rich, it's interactable. Now, none of this was coded up. It was all generated by Gemini. Gemini uses a series of reasoning steps, going from broad decisions to increasingly higher resolution of reasoning, finally getting to code and data. First, Gemini considers, does it even need an UI? Is a text prompt best? Okay, this is a complex request that needs lots of information to be presented in an organized way. Gemini then tries to understand if it knows enough to help. There is a lot of ambiguity. I didn't say what my daughter's interests are or what kind of a party I wanted, so it had asked a clarifying question. When I said, we're thinking about an outdoor party and my daughter loves animals, Gemini reasoned it had enough information to proceed. But it made a note that there was still ambiguity about what kind of animals, and this is important, and what kind of outdoor party. Next is a critical step. Gemini writes the product requirement document, or PRD. It contains the plan for the kinds of functionality the experience will have. For instance, it should show different possible party themes, some activities, and food options for them. Now, based on this PRD, Gemini tries to design the best experience for the user's journey. It thinks that the user will like to explore a list of options, but will also want to delve into details. It uses this to design a list and detailed layout that we saw earlier. With this design, it writes the Flutter code to compose the interface out of widgets and write any functionality needed. Finally, it generates and retrieves the data needed to render the experience. You can see it filling in content and images for the different sections. Farm animals. She would like that. Clicking on the interface regenerates the data to be rendered by the code it wrote. Ooh, I know she likes cupcakes. I can now click on anything in the interface and ask it for more information. I could say, step-by-step instructions on how to bake this. And it starts to generate a new UI. This time, it designs an UI best suited for giving me step-by-step instructions. I want to find some suitable cake toppers for this. Show me some farm animal cake toppers. At this point, Gemini again decides to create a visually rich experience. It generates a gallery of images. Notice the drop-downs at the top. It decided that maybe it should help me explore by showing different options. Sheep sounds interesting, I know she likes that. And now it helps me pick sheep cake toppers. These look great. This is going to be a fun birthday party. I hope you saw a glimpse of what Gemini is capable of. I'm really excited about what's possible here. This is such an interesting time in AI, and I'm excited to be part of this.
Cool. All right. So this helps you get some context of the art of possible of the kind of interfaces that we expect to see in this new brave world. But equally, we wanted to end the sort of presentation by making sure that while our aspirations are very bold, our approach is very responsible, right? And we realize that the best way to actually start on the AI journey within the organization is to start responsibly in the first place. So back in 2016-17, we actually laid out the AI principles. And these are a good guidance for you to look at if you want to apply this within your organization. There's a lot of documentation available on the website. But the possibilities are absolutely endless. In fact, we've tried this consistently over the last 25 years, applying this within the products. Whenever there was a new technological leap, you saw at the start the internet and with mobile, we applied this and we've seen considered value being created in this process. So this quote is always helpful to remind us that this is yet another opportunity to apply this within our careers. So with that, thank you very much for your patience with all